I never thought I'd find something beautiful in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by mud and exhaustion and the constant barking of drill sergeants. But there I was, lying on my back in a cramped two-man tent at Fort Benning, staring at the canvas ceiling while rain pattered against the fabric, realizing that the guy next to me had just changed everything. His name was Marcus Chen, and for 3 weeks of basic training, he'd been just another face in our platoon. Tall, lean, with this quiet intensity that made him seem older than 22. We'd been randomly assigned as tent partners for our week-long field training exercise, and honestly, I'd been dreading it. I'm not great with silence, and Marcus seemed like the type who could go hours without saying a word. But that first night, after we'd dug our foxhole and set up our shelter half, after the sun had finally set and we were both lying there in the dark, he'd surprised me. "You scared?" he'd asked, his voice soft in the darkness. I'd laughed, trying to play it off. "Of what? The imaginary enemy? Pretty sure they're not actually going to attack us." "Not that," he'd said. "Just all of it, being here, becoming someone different." And that's when I realized Marcus wasn't quiet because he had nothing to say. He was quiet because he was thinking, always thinking, processing everything around him in that careful way of his. I'd told him, yeah, I was scared. Scared I wasn't strong enough, scared I'd fail, scared I'd disappoint everyone who believed in me. We'd talked until nearly midnight, whispering so the drill sergeants wouldn't hear us, and when we finally fell asleep, something had shifted between us. The next morning, he'd woken me up 15 minutes before Reveille. I'd been confused, groggy, ready to ask him what the hell he was doing, but he'd just put his finger to his lips and gestured for me to follow him outside. The sun wasn't up yet, just this thin line of gold on the horizon, and the whole training area was silent, except for the birds starting their morning songs. We'd walked maybe 50 yards from the tent line to this spot where you could see out over the valley, and we'd just stood there, watching the sunrise together. "Thought you might want to see this," he'd said, "before the day gets crazy." That became our thing. Every morning for the next 6 days, Marcus would wake me before Reveille, and we'd steal those few quiet minutes together. We never talked much during those moments. We'd just stand there, shoulders sometimes touching, watching the world wake up. And every morning, I felt something growing in my chest, something I couldn't name and didn't want to examine too closely. By day 4, I was hyper-aware of everything about him. The way he moved during drills, economical and precise. The way he'd quietly help other soldiers who were struggling, never making a big deal of it. The way his eyes would find mine across the training field, and he'd give me this tiny nod like we had a secret, which I guess we did, in a way. Those sunrise moments were ours alone. I'd had crushes before, quick, easy things that faded as fast as they came. But this felt different, deeper, more terrifying, because Marcus wasn't just some guy I'd met at a party or matched with on an app. He was my tent partner, my battle buddy, someone I had to see every single day for the next several months. And more than that, we were in the Army, where even after Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, there was still this unspoken code, this assumption that everyone was straight until proven otherwise. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that Marcus was just being friendly, that those early morning wake-ups were just him being considerate. But then there was the way he'd look at me sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention. This softness in his expression that made my heart race. The way our hands would brush when we were breaking down the tent, and he'd let the contact linger just a second too long. On the 5th morning, when he woke me up, it was raining. Not hard, just a steady drizzle that made everything gray and misty. I'd assumed we'd skip our ritual, but Marcus had just handed me my poncho and waited while I put it on. We'd walked to our spot, and instead of watching the sunrise, which was hidden behind thick clouds, we just stood there in the rain, not saying anything. "Why? Why do you do this?" I'd finally asked. "Wake me up early, I mean." He'd been quiet for a long moment, and I could see him working something out in his head, deciding how honest to be. "Because those few minutes with you are the best part of my day," he'd said finally. "Because out here we can just be. No performance, no pretending. Just us." My heart had been hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Marcus, you don't have to say anything," he'd cut me off gently. "I just wanted you to know, that's all." We'd walked back to the tent in silence, and all day I'd been distracted, replaying his words, trying to understand what they meant, what I was supposed to do with them. During land navigation training, I'd gotten so turned around that our drill sergeant had threatened to make me repeat the entire exercise. Marcus had found me, helped me get my bearings, and when our hands touched on the compass, he'd squeezed my fingers once, quick and reassuring, before letting go. That night, lying in the tent with maybe 6 inches between us, I couldn't sleep. I could hear Marcus breathing, steady and even, and I'd thought he was asleep, but then his voice had come out of the darkness. "I'm not trying to make things weird," he'd said. "If you want, we can just forget I said anything. Go back to how things were." I'd rolled onto my side, facing him even though I could barely make out his silhouette in the dark. What if I don't want to forget? The silence that followed felt enormous, like the whole world was holding its breath. Then Marcus had shifted, rolling to face me too, and even in the darkness I could feel the intensity of his gaze. "Then what do you want?" he'd asked, and his voice had this vulnerability in it that made my chest ache. "I don't know," I'd admitted. I've thought about it, about guys, but I never let myself really go there, you know? It seemed too complicated, too risky. Easier to just ignore it. "And now? Now I can't stop thinking about you," I'd said, and saying it out loud felt like jumping off a cliff. "Every morning when you wake me up, I'm grateful for another day where I get to be near you, and that scares the hell out of me." Marcus had reached out then, his hand finding mine in the dark, our fingers interlacing. "I'm scared too," he'd whispered, "but maybe being scared together is better than being safe and alone." We'd fallen asleep like that, holding hands, and when I woke up in the morning, his face was the first thing I saw. He was already awake, watching me with this soft expression that made me want to kiss him more than I'd ever wanted anything. But we couldn't. Not here, not with 30 other soldiers sleeping 20 feet away. So instead, I'd squeezed his hand and smiled, and he'd smiled back, and it felt like a promise. That morning, our 6th sunrise together, felt different. The air was crisp and cool, and the sky was this incredible gradient of orange and pink and purple. We stood closer than usual, our shoulders pressed together, and I could feel the warmth of him through our uniforms. "One more day," Marcus said quietly. "Then we're back to the barracks, back to real life." "What happens then?" I asked. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'd like to find out, if you want to." I did want to, more than anything, but I was also terrified of what it would mean, how it would change things, what we'd be risking. The Army might have changed its policies, but that didn't mean everyone had changed their minds. There were still guys in our platoon who made jokes, who used slurs casually, who made it clear what they thought about people like us. "I'm not brave like you," I said. "I don't know if I can do this." Marcus turned to face me fully, and in the growing light I could see every detail of his face. "You're braver than you think," he said. "You told me the truth last night. That took courage. That was different. That was just us in the dark. So we start there," he said. "Just us. We don't have to announce anything or make some big statement. We just see where this goes. Take it one day at a time." I wanted to believe it could be that simple, but I'd seen what happened to guys who got caught, who got reported. Even with the policy change, there were ways to make life difficult, ways to other someone until they couldn't take it anymore and requested a transfer or just quit altogether. "What if someone finds out?" I asked. "Then we deal with it," Marcus said, "together, but we can't live our lives based on what-ifs and fear. Trust me, I've tried. It doesn't work." The sun was fully up now, and in the distance I could hear the first sounds of the camp waking up. We'd have to head back soon, get ready for our final day of field training. Tomorrow we'd pack up and march back to the barracks, and this strange, intense week would be over. But whatever happened next, I knew I didn't want to lose this. Lose him. "Okay," I said. "Let's try. Just us, taking it one day at a time." Marcus smiled, this full, genuine smile that transformed his whole face, and I realized I'd do just about anything to see that smile again. We walked back to the tent, and as we started breaking down our gear for the final day, our hands kept finding reasons to touch. A brush of fingers when passing equipment, a steadied hand on a shoulder, small moments that felt enormous. That last day of training was brutal. A 12-mile ruck march, followed by a final combat simulation, followed by more marching. By the time we made it back to our tent that night, I was so exhausted I could barely keep my eyes open. But I didn't want to sleep, didn't want to waste our last night together in this strange little bubble we'd created. "Hey," Marcus said softly, and I realized I'd been staring at him. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, "just thinking about tomorrow, going back to normal." "This can be normal too," he said, "if we want it to be." "I want it to be," I said, and I meant it. We stayed up talking until almost midnight, making plans. We'd be careful, discreet, but we'd find ways to spend time together. Weekend passes, off-base apartments eventually, quiet spaces where we could just be ourselves. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth having ever was. When we finally did fall asleep, I was acutely aware of his presence next to me, the sound of his breathing, the warmth of him in the small space. And when I woke up the next morning, it was to Marcus gently shaking my shoulder, a soft smile on his face. "One more sunrise?" he asked. I followed him out into the pre-dawn darkness, and we walked to our spot for the last time. The sky was clear, stars still visible overhead, and as we stood there waiting for the sun, Marcus reached over and took my hand. Not hiding, not worried about who might see in the dim light, just holding my hand because he wanted to. "Thank you," I said, "for waking me up, for all of this." "Thank you for saying yes," he replied, "for taking the chance." We watched the sun come up together, and as the light grew stronger, I felt something settle in my chest, a certainty I hadn't felt before. This was right. Scary, complicated, potentially difficult, but right. And whatever came next, we'd face it together. When we got back to the tent, the rest of the platoon was already stirring, getting ready for the march back. We packed up our gear in comfortable silence, working together with the ease of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. And as we lined up for formation, Marcus caught my eye and gave me that tiny nod, our secret signal. The march back was long, but I barely noticed the weight of my ruck or the ache in my feet. I kept thinking about those quiet mornings, about Marcus's hand in mine, about the possibility of what came next. And I realized that somewhere in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by mud and exhaustion, I'd found something I didn't even know I was looking for. I'd found someone who saw me, really saw me, and wasn't afraid of what he found. Someone who woke me up before Reveille so we could have a few minutes alone, a few minutes that were just ours. Someone worth being brave for. That was 6 months ago. We're still together, still taking it one day at a time. We have an apartment off base now. A tiny one-bedroom that's barely big enough for both of us, but it's ours. A place where we don't have to hide or pretend. Where we can just be Marcus and me, two guys who found each other in the unlikeliest of places. Sometimes, on our days off, we wake up early and watch the sunrise together. And every time, I'm reminded of those field training mornings, of the moment everything changed, of the courage it took to admit what I was feeling, and the courage it took to let myself be loved. People ask me sometimes what I learned in basic training. They expect me to talk about discipline or physical fitness or tactical skills. And sure, I learned all that. But what I really learned was that love shows up in unexpected places. That sometimes the person who changes your life is the one sleeping 6 inches away in a cramped tent. That being vulnerable is scarier than any drill sergeant, but it's also the only way to find something real. Marcus still wakes me up sometimes, even though we don't have to sneak around anymore. He'll gently shake my shoulder in the pre-dawn darkness and whisper, "Want to watch the sunrise?" And I always say yes. Because those quiet moments together, just us watching the world wake up, they're still the best part of my day.